The U.S. warned Iran, not quietly, not subtly, but publicly, and with the kind of language that doesn't leave room for misinterpretation. Washington said the killing had to stop, that protesters couldn't keep dying in the streets, that the regime couldn't keep treating its own people like enemies of the state. And yet, the deaths didn't stop. The arrests didn't stop. The executions didn't stop. And now, after weeks of threats, signals, and warnings, the United States is doing what it always does when diplomacy fails and deterrence is questioned. It is moving steel. Because there's one truth that every regime understands, even those that pretend they don't fear the West. Words are noise. Warships are not. In recent days, the U.S. has made a move that is impossible to ignore. A U.S. aircraft carrier strike group has been directed toward the region, bringing with it the kind of power that doesn't exist to send a message. It exists to end a fight before it begins. And in Tehran, they know exactly what it means. Because when an American carrier shows up, it's never just about presence. It's about options. It's about pressure. It's about a countdown. And for Iran's leadership, for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the entire structure that has held the country in an iron grip for decades, the clock is ticking. The aircraft carrier at the center of this escalation is the USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the U.S. Navy's most powerful floating air bases. A ship designed not for defense, not for show, but for offensive reach, the ability to strike deep, fast, and repeatedly, with almost no warning. The Lincoln doesn't travel alone. It never does. It moves like the heart of a moving fortress, surrounded by escort ships designed to protect it from exactly the kind of retaliation Iran has been promising for years. Missiles, drones, and asymmetric attacks that could turn the waters of the Gulf into a death trap. With it come guided missile destroyers, warships packed with vertical launch systems capable of firing cruise missiles, interceptors, and air defense weapons in rapid succession. These ships aren't there to look intimidating. They're there to keep the carrier alive long enough to do its job. And its job is simple. If ordered, the Lincoln's air wing can deliver a wave of strikes so heavy, so sustained, and so precise that the regime's military infrastructure could begin collapsing in a matter of hours. That's the reality Tehran is facing. Because the Lincoln carries a range of aircraft designed for modern war, fighter jets built for air superiority, strike missions, suppression of enemy air defenses, electronic warfare, surveillance, and rapid response. The carrier doesn't just bring bombs. It brings eyes. It brings ears. It brings the ability to see Iran's moves before Iran makes them. And that changes everything. Now, when the U.S. moves a carrier strike group into striking distance of a country like Iran, it triggers a reaction that is almost automatic. Iranian air defenses go on alert. Missile units disperse. Naval forces prepare to operate in swarms. Radar stations switch patterns. Command bunkers begin preparing for continuity of government scenarios. Because even if Washington says it doesn't want war, Iran understands the American method. The U.S. doesn't bluff with carriers. A carrier is what you send when you want leverage, or when you're preparing to act. And the language coming out of Washington has been just vague enough to keep Iran guessing, which, strategically, is exactly the point, because uncertainty is a weapon. If Iran knows the U.S. will strike, it can prepare. If Iran knows the U.S. will not strike, it can escalate. But if Iran does not know what is coming, if Tehran cannot tell whether this is pressure, preparation, or the first move in something much bigger, then every decision becomes riskier, and the regime hates risk, especially now, because Iran isn't facing only an external threat. It's facing internal collapse pressure at the same time. Protests have been spreading, and whether they started from economic anger, political rage, or sheer exhaustion from years of oppression, they become something the regime fears more than sanctions. Because sanctions hurt the economy, but protests threaten the system. And this is a nightmare scenario. A regime fighting to control its streets while foreign power gathers offshore. It's the kind of situation that makes leaders paranoid. It makes generals nervous. It makes security forces brutal. And brutality, in turn, fuels the protests even more. This is how regimes fall. Not always from invasion, but from pressure building from every direction until something breaks. And here's what makes this moment even more dangerous. Iran has spent years building a retaliation network designed for exactly this kind of confrontation. Iran doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy head-to-head to cause chaos. It only needs to make the region burn. It needs to raise the cost of action. It needs to threaten energy routes, destabilize allies, and create the kind of crisis where the world begs for de-escalation, not because Iran is winning, but because the consequences are too painful. And Tehran has options. Iran has anti-ship missiles designed to threaten vessels that come too close. Some are coastal systems meant to turn narrow waters into kill zones. Others are mobile launchers designed to relocate quickly after firing. Some are cruise missiles built to skim low and avoid radar. Others are ballistic missiles intended to strike fast and hard with little warning. And then there are drones. Thousands of them, cheap, expendable, and designed to overwhelm defenses by sheer volume. Iran also has something else. Something that makes the U.S. military take this seriously even when Iran is bluffing. Geography. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important choke points on Earth. A narrow stretch of water where global energy flows through a funnel. And Iran sits on that funnel like a hand around a throat. Even the hint that Iran might disrupt traffic, there's enough to rattle global markets. Because it isn't just oil. It's the psychological effect of uncertainty. Shipping insurance rates jump. Tanker traffic reroutes. Energy prices spike. And the global economy feels the shockwaves. That's why, when Iran threatens retaliation, it cannot be dismissed casually. And Iran knows this. It uses this leverage constantly, like a man holding matches inside a room full of gasoline. But here's the problem for Tehran. The U.S. has prepared for this scenario for decades. Carrier strike groups don't enter these waters blindly. They operate with layered defense, destroyers with radar networks, interceptors, electronic warfare, decoys, and coordination with regional bases. They train to handle swarms. They train to handle missile salvos. They train for the worst. So Iran's threats, while dangerous, are not automatically decisive. But what makes this moment so volatile is not Iran's military strength. It's Iran's desperation. Because when a regime begins to feel that its survival is at stake, it stops thinking like a government and starts thinking like a cornered animal. And cornered animals don't calculate costs the way rational actors do. They lash out. They gamble. They escalate. And that's what has U.S. planners watching Tehran so closely right now. Because Iran may believe that it has only two choices. Back down and appear weak, which encourages the protests, or strike outward to rally nationalism, and risk igniting a war it cannot control. Either way, the regime loses something. And that's why this moment is so dangerous. Because when a regime feels it is losing control of its own people, it becomes willing to do things it would never do from a position of strength. Now, the carrier strike group is moving. The pressure is rising. And Iran's leadership is telling the world that any strike, limited, surgical, or symbolic, will be treated as all-out war. That statement is not just rhetoric. It is a warning. A warning that if Washington crosses a line, Iran could respond across multiple fronts. Against U.S. bases, against regional allies, against shipping routes, and through proxy forces that can strike without Iran taking direct blame. And yes, proxies matter. Because Iran's influence isn't confined to its borders. It has built networks in the region specifically so it can fight indirectly. Militias, armed groups, political allies with weapons. This gives Tehran a way to retaliate without risking immediate annihilation. But it also makes conflict harder to contain. Because once proxies start firing, the region becomes a chain reaction. And chain reactions don't stop when you want them to. They stop when they burn out, or when something snaps. So the question becomes brutally simple. What does Washington actually want? Is this carrier movement meant to scare Tehran into restraint? Is it meant to force negotiations? Or is it something much darker? A preparation for strikes that will weaken the regime so severely that it can no longer hold power? Because if the U.S. decides that Iran's leadership is a true source of instability, then this isn't deterrence. It's the beginning of regime pressure at a level Iran has not faced in decades. And Tehran knows it. That's why the regime has raised alert levels. That's why threats are increasing. That's why the region feels like it's holding its breath. Because when a carrier strike group arrives near your coastline, it means the U.S. has brought the ability to reshape your future. And now, Iran has to decide what kind of future it wants to gamble for. Because the next move doesn't belong to the protesters. It doesn't even belong to the generals. It belongs to the regime. And if you're enjoying this kind of real military storytelling, where we break down what's happening and what it really means, make sure you subscribe right now. You don't want to miss what comes next. Now here's the question. Is this carrier group just meant to intimidate Iran into backing down? Or is this the opening step towards something far bigger? The moment a U.S. aircraft carrier enters a region, the headlines focus on the ship itself. The flight deck, the jets, the escorts, the missiles, the sheer scale of it all. It's cinematic, it's intimidating, and it's easy to understand. A floating city of war, inching closer like a storm cloud. But what most people miss is that the carrier isn't the real weapon. The real weapon is what the carrier represents. A shift from warnings to leverage, from statements to capability, from diplomacy to force. And once that shift happens, everything around it changes. Because the carrier isn't arriving in a vacuum. It's arriving in a region already soaked in tension, where every actor is armed, paranoid, and watching the same waters. The Gulf isn't just a body of water. It's a pressure chamber. And when the U.S. pumps in military power, that chamber starts to compress. That compression is what Tehran feels. And Tehran is responding the way regimes always respond when they feel pressure from outside and instability from within. By tightening its grip in the streets. That means more arrests, harsher crackdowns, and the same brutal logic the regime has relied on for decades. The belief that fear can silence the population. That if you punish enough people publicly, the rest will stay quiet. But the regime has a problem now that it didn't have in past crises. The world is watching more closely. And the U.S. is watching too. Washington has made it clear that the killing of protesters is not just a domestic matter anymore. It's being treated as a trigger, a line in the sand that the regime keeps crossing. And when a regime crosses enough lines, it eventually forces an answer. And that answer is now sailing toward Iran. So what does Iran do? It does what it always does. It tries to make the cost of action feel unbearable. The regime begins signaling readiness. Military units go on alert. State media pushes defiant messaging. Generals speak in the language of resistance and martyrdom. Missiles are showcased. Drone factories are praised. The narrative becomes predictable. Iran is strong. Iran is prepared. Iran will respond. But behind bravado, there's fear. Because Iran's leadership understands something the public doesn't always grasp. If the U.S. won a conventional fight, Iran would lose. Not slowly, not in a heroic struggle. It would lose quickly, violently, and in ways that could shatter the regime's aura of control. Iran's real power has never been its ability to defeat the United States in open battle. Iran's power has always been its ability to complicate, to disrupt, to bleed, to prolong. It's the art of turning a conflict into a mess so painful that the stronger party decides it's not worth it. That's why Iran leans so heavily on proxies, asymmetric tactics, and threats to global energy flows. Because those tools allow Iran to punch above its weight. They allow Tehran to threaten chaos, even when it can't win a direct fight. But the problem is this. Chaos is a fire you don't always control. And right now, Tehran is playing with that fire in a room full of gasoline. Because if the regime feels it is being pushed toward the edge, if it believes that Washington is not just pressuring but preparing, then Iran may decide it has no choice but to escalate first, to strike before it is struck, to create a crisis so large that the U.S. hesitates, to make the world panic. This is the logic of desperation, and it's why carrier movements are so dangerous. They don't just deter. They provoke calculations. They create timelines. They force decisions. Now, to understand what could happen next, you have to understand the menu of options on both sides, because this is not a simple standoff where one side wins and the other loses. This is a contest of escalation, a ladder where each step is more dangerous than the last. On the U.S. side, the options range from symbolic to catastrophic. Washington could simply keep the carrier in the region as a warning. It could increase surveillance, tighten sanctions, and apply pressure through diplomacy. It could support information operations that encourage internal resistance. It could quietly assist opposition movements in ways that are hard to prove but easy to feel. Or it could do something far more direct. It could strike. And if it strikes, the question becomes, what does it strike? There are different categories of targets, and each category sends a different message. Striking air defense systems tells Iran, your shield is gone. Striking missile launch sites tells Iran, your retaliation options are being removed. Striking drone infrastructure tells Iran, your asymmetric tools are being dismantled. Striking command and control nodes tells Iran, your leaders are vulnerable. And striking elite security organs that protect the regime tells Iran something far more terrifying. This is no longer about deterrence. This is about survival. This is where the phrase regime change starts appearing in discussions. Because regime change doesn't always mean tanks rolling into a capital. Sometimes it means applying so much pressure, externally and internally, that the regime collapses under its own weight. But the U.S. has to be careful, because every strike creates consequences. Iran will retaliate, not because it wants to, but because it has to. If it doesn't, it looks weak. And weakness is lethal for a regime facing protests. Weakness invites more protests. Weakness fractures loyalty. Weakness creates rivals. So retaliation becomes mandatory. And Iran's retaliation doesn't have to be symmetrical. It doesn't need to sink a carrier to create a crisis. It only needs to make the region bleed. It needs to hit U.S. bases with missiles. It needs to unleash proxy attacks. It needs to disrupt shipping. It needs to strike allies. It needs to trigger a regional chain reaction. And the most dangerous part is that Iran has spent years building exactly this kind of capability, the ability to ignite multiple fronts at once. In Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, Iran's influence isn't just political. It's armed. It's embedded. It's ready. So if Tehran decides to retaliate broadly, it could do it through many hands, in many places, all at once. And that creates a nightmare for Washington, a conflict that doesn't have one battlefield, but several. This is why every move in the Gulf feels heavier than it looks. Because the Gulf is the center of a spider web. Touch it, and the entire web vibrates. Now add another factor that makes this even more unstable: miscalculation. Because both sides are trying to look strong. And when both sides try to look strong, the risk of accident skyrockets. A drone gets too close. A radar locks onto the wrong target. A militia fires a rocket at the wrong time. A ship misreads an approach. A missile defense system launches an error. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a warning becomes a war. This is a terrifying part of escalation. Once momentum builds, it becomes difficult to stop. Leaders get trapped by their own messaging. Domestic audiences demand action. Military planners follow protocols. And before anyone can pull the brakes, the machine is already moving. This is why Iran's leadership is likely doing two things at once right now: preparing for confrontation while secretly hoping to avoid it, because the regime knows what it risks. If Iran escalates too hard, it could invite devastating strikes that cripple its military. If Iran escalates too softly, it could appear weak and lose control at home. And if Iran does nothing, the protests may grow, the fractures may widen, and the regime may begin losing its grip permanently. So Iran is caught in a trap, and Washington knows it. That's why the carrier is so powerful, not just as a weapon, but as psychological pressure. It forces Iran to think about consequences in ways it cannot ignore. It forces Tehran to consider the possibility that this time the U.S. might actually act. And whether Washington intends to strike or not, the regime has to behave as if it might. Now here's the key moment in all of this, the moment that turns pressure into panic. If Iran's leadership starts to believe that the U.S. is not just sending a message, but positioning for action, then Tehran's calculus changes dramatically. At that point, it may decide that its only hope is to create enough chaos fast enough that Washington steps back. That's the logic of the corner regime. Shock the world, disrupt the region, force negotiations, survive another day. But that's also the logic that starts wars. And this is why the arrival of U.S. warships near Iran is not just a military move. It's a trigger event. It is the kind of move that makes the region's most dangerous actors begin reaching for their most dangerous tools. Because if the regime believes the clock is ticking, it will act like it has nothing left to lose. And that's when something very bad stops being a prediction and starts becoming a timeline. Right now, the Middle East feels like it's holding its breath. Because when the USS Abraham Lincoln and its strike group push deeper into position, it isn't just another deployment. It's the moment the chessboard becomes real. The kind of moment where everyone involved understands that the next move may not be reversible. And here's the most dangerous part. In this kind of standoff, it only takes one spark. Not a full-scale decision from the White House. Not a formal declaration. Not even an official strike order. Just one spark. A militia rocket landing on the wrong base. A drone swarm launched at the wrong time. A missile fired as a warning. That hits something important. A naval encounter that escalates in minutes. A commander who thinks he's acting defensively, but triggers the first shot of a war. And once that happens, the logic of escalation takes over. Because Iran cannot afford to look weak, and the U.S. cannot afford to look hesitant. That's how conflicts begin. Not because both sides want war, but because both sides feel they can't back down. Now, the reason Washington is moving this force into the region isn't just about optics. It's about building a set of options and giving Iran's regime a choice it hates more than anything. That choice is simple. Stop or pay. And the pay part isn't just sanctions anymore. It's steel. It's jets. It's missiles. It's the ability to strike Iran's critical infrastructure, its command structure, and the elite security forces that keep the regime alive. Because the U.S. knows something that the Iranian public knows too. Iran's regime doesn't survive on popularity. It survives on fear. And fear only works if the security apparatus stays loyal, funded, and intact. That's why the most threatening thing the U.S. can do isn't even sinking ships or destroying airfields. It's weakening the regime's grip, and the regime knows it. That's why Tehran is likely making moves right now behind the scenes that it will never admit publicly. Moves that are meant to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Because from Iran's perspective, the U.S. carrier group doesn't just mean pressure. It could mean the opening phase of something much bigger. Something like a campaign to neutralize Iran's missile forces, strikes on drone production and launch networks, attacks on air defenses to open the skies, cyber operations to disrupt command systems, and coordinated pressure designed to break the regime from multiple angles at once. And if that's the path Washington chooses, then Iran's best defense is not to win. It's to make the price of action so high that the U.S. hesitates. That's where the Strait of Hormuz comes in. Because the strait isn't just geography, it's leverage. A narrow corridor that a huge portion of the world's oil traffic depends on. Iran doesn't need to shut it down completely to cause panic. It only needs to create enough danger that insurers spike costs, shipping slows, and global markets start reacting. That's why even a few mines, a few attacks, or even credible threats can ripple across the world economy. And Tehran knows it. But here's the twist. If Iran threatens Hormuz too aggressively, it risks triggering the very responsive fears. Because the U.S. Navy exists for exactly this scenario. Keeping sea lanes open is one of America's red lines. And if Iran crosses it, Washington's restraint becomes politically impossible. That's why the regime's options are narrowing. It wants to show strength without provoking destruction. It wants to intimidate without inviting strikes. It wants to punish without triggering collapse. But that balancing act becomes almost impossible when protests are spreading internally. Because internal unrest changes everything. When a regime is stable, it can play games. It can wait. It can posture. But when a regime feels instability in its own streets, it starts behaving differently. It becomes more paranoid, more violent, more reckless, and above all, more desperate. Because once the regime starts believing it's fighting for survival, it will do things it wouldn't normally do. That includes cracking down harder at home and escalating abroad. Because regimes under pressure often follow a brutal logic. If the people are angry, create an external enemy. If the streets are burning, start a confrontation that unites loyalists. If you're losing control internally, export the crisis outward. This is exactly why the timing of this moment is so dangerous. The protests are not just a background story. They are the fuel, and the carrier group is the match. Now, if you zoom out and look at this whole situation from a strategic perspective, there are only a few paths forward, and every path is risky. Path 1. Iran backs off, reduces violence, calms the streets, and avoids escalation. But that makes a regime look weak, and weakness invites more unrest. Path 2. Iran cracks down even harder and dares the U.S. to respond. But that risks U.S. strikes and a regional chain reaction. Path 3. Iran escalates through proxies, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, to hit U.S. assets without direct fingerprints. But Washington has grown far less tolerant of proxy warfare, and it may treat it as Iranian action anyway. Path 4. Iran does something dramatic, like threatening Hormuz or attacking shipping, to force the world into panic mode. But that could trigger a coalition response, and Tehran knows it. No matter which path Iran chooses, the regime is gambling. And the scariest part is that Washington may already be expecting that gamble. Because carriers don't move like this for no reason. The U.S. doesn't position that much power that close unless it wants Tehran to understand something very clearly. This time, there may not be another warning. Now, here's where everything gets even darker. The carrier group is only what you can see. The U.S. Navy's most dangerous assets are often the ones you can't. Submarines, cyber units, special operations capabilities, surveillance platforms that can see deeper than Iran wants to admit. Meaning, Iran may already be under pressure from forces it can't track. And that creates paranoia inside the regime. And paranoia makes mistakes more likely. So the question becomes, what happens when a regime decides it can't wait anymore? Because if Tehran believes a strike is coming, or believes the U.S. is preparing to tip the balance toward regime collapse, then Iran may decide it must act first. And that first move might not be a missile launch. It might be something quieter. A coordinated proxy strike. A sabotage operation. A sudden escalation in Yemen. A cyber attack on energy infrastructure. A surprise naval incident in the Gulf. Something designed to send a message without triggering full-scale retaliation. But in a region like this, messages don't stay contained. They spiral. They spread. They multiply. And once the first domino falls, the rest don't ask permission. So as the USS Abraham Lincoln pushes closer, and as Iran's forces remain on alert, and as the streets continue to boil, we are approaching the most dangerous moment of the entire crisis. The moment where someone decides the next move. Because after that, there may be no going back. And here's the cliffhanger that should keep you watching. If Iran's regime believes it's cornered, the next step may not be defense. It may be desperation. And desperation is what starts wars the world never intended to fight. So the real question isn't whether something is about to happen. It's who makes the first irreversible move. If you enjoyed this breakdown and you want more stories told exactly like this, high stakes, real world military tension, explained in a way that actually makes sense, then hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And I want to ask you a serious question. Do you think this U.S. carrier deployment is just pressure or the opening stage of something much bigger? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them all. Because in the next video, we'll look at the one scenario military analysts fear the most. The scenario where the first strike doesn't come from Washington. It comes from Tehran. And if that happens, the Middle East could ignite overnight.